This lecture is on urban sustainability, particularly as it relates to cities in the global south. So when we look at contemporary cities, what do we see? In industrialized countries, cities have largely become shaped to built to become automobile sized. That is to say, they're designed and built in order to accommodate automobiles and allow little or no access to pedestrians in many parts of the city. So you see landscapes like this where you only see cars, vehicles on the road and no pedestrians, no bicycles and so on. And even for people to get across these areas, it becomes very complicated because of highways coming in between and so on. What this generates is a kind of land use pattern that's known as sprawl. Sprawl is the relentless growth of cities well beyond their limits, just because it becomes easier to live far away from the centers of these cities. And in turn, what ends up happening is you have jobs and other amenities away from cities. If you look at two cities having the same population, the city of Atlanta and the city of Barcelona, roughly the same population, because Barcelona was largely built around public transport, around buses and trains, it's retained its compact shape. In contrast, Atlanta in the United States has encountered a lot of sprawl. It's spread out. It's become automobile sized. So sprawl is self-reinforcing in the sense that residences, shops, schools, jobs and recreation are all distant from one another, and they require cars and a built environment to support them. So that's what you see in many cities in the global north, but certainly not all, as I showed you, this example of Barcelona being quite different from Atlanta. What happens in the global south, or conventionally known as the third world, is several other factors. So in the developing world, urbanization has taken place largely in a mixed mode. There's lots of legacies over time, lots of different things shaping those cities. So one of them is the state or the government attempts to shape the city along design strategies developed in wealthy countries. So that is a push towards more automobilization, more cars, more highways, less access for pedestrians, even though the bulk of the users of roads tend to be pedestrians, people without access to cars, they tend to be bicyclists and so on. Other challenges, of course, in third world cities is that there's very dense mixed-use housing, lots of slums. We'll go over what slums imply in third world cities, and many modes of vehicles, different types of vehicles, leading to an overall slowdown on the streets. Slums imply poor access to infrastructure. There's both in terms of the physical concentration and dispersion, and there's both formal and informal modes of labor associated with slums. But the good news about many developing country cities is that if transport modes were to be, transport planning were to be well designed, it's actually helpful to have this mixed high density and mixed use, meaning residences and shops and schools and so on tend to be in close proximity. So it's possible to make developing country cities less prone to sprawl. Now, if we looked at a country like India, we see that India has really a very large diversity, and that's one of the challenges that produces difficulties for planning in cities. You have a small fraction of the population that actually tends to be very influential. 5% of the population has an average income of around 20,000 US dollars. They're roughly the size of half of Russia. And then you have 65% of the population having a much lower average income, roughly the same per capita GDP as Ghana, and they're 5 times the size of Ghana, that's 65% of the population, and about 30% of the population, roughly those below the poverty line, have the same average income as Ivory Coast or Côte d'Ivoire. So you see this vast diversity also affecting the way in which city planning is sort of compromised in many developing countries, particularly a country like India. Now, when we come to this question of slums, slums are ubiquitous across the developing world. You also find slums even in some rich countries like the US. And what really happens in slums is that these are either formal or informal settlements of very poor people living in very difficult conditions where the infrastructure is poor, the access to particularly water, sanitation tends to be very poor. Now, this is what a typical slum looks like. You have, as you can tell, there's very poor quality housing. The housing is also alongside a riverbank or a canal, usually, because that's also the sort of it epitomizes the sort of the informality of these settlements, the illegality of these settlements, if you like, and and conditions are pretty pathetic because there's a lot of pollution that people are exposed to, and very crowded conditions leading to disease and other challenges. Now, another word for slums is squatter settlements. Reason for that is that these are essentially settlements where people have decided to live in conditions in proximity to their jobs, and squatters are considered illegal settlers, and so they're always living in precarious conditions. As I already mentioned, crowding is a big challenge in these squatter settlements. The land that is squatted upon is not well developed, so there's very little access to services, and squatting sometimes takes place either on public property or on private property, and sometimes speculative landholding is responsible for is a site where squatter settlements can be found. Sometimes regulatory requirements or rent controls make investing on such land unprofitable. Squatters do not pay formal rent, but they do incur costs. Usually they're paying some kind of rent or some kind of money, some kind of fee to people who control the land. Now, what are the forces of urbanization in general? What causes cities to form, and how do these take shape? Paul Krugman, the well-known economist, has divided these into centripetal and centrifugal forces. So the centripetal forces are forces that actually cause cities to form, concentrated settlements to form, has to do with a variety of factors. So one of them, of course, is that there are natural advantages of particular sites, usually a valley or the mouth of a river near a port, and so on. Sometimes the fact that a place is a central location at the confluence of roads, of major highways, can also be a reason for a city to form, for cities to cities are really used to be, many cities in these kinds of centers of highways or at mouths of rivers near harbors used to be trading posts, trading towns, market towns. And so market conditions also create urbanization, or sort of pull cities together. Access to markets, what are known as backward linkages. When there's a hinterland, that's a reason for a city to grow, or to form and grow. Access to products, again for trade, and labor markets. So the fact that you have large concentrations of of especially young people available for work. That's also a reason for cities to form. And cities can also grow because of what are known as knowledge spillovers. You might have a university or a set of training institutes nearby, and that causes that, and because the people, well-educated people, trained people coming out of these universities, you have cities growing in these areas. Now, some of the centrifugal forces that work against concentrated urban settlements could be again related to markets. So questions of you know, the prices, land prices, and so on becoming too high, commuting costs becoming high, the pull of dispersed resources such as farmland, mainly as a result of advantages being outside. And then there could be non-market forces as well. For instance, people might feel that the aesthetic qualities of a city are no longer attractive. Some other place is more attractive, or technologies might also lead to the growth of you know, telecommuting and so on. So that might also leave cities less crowded. Or you might have a natural disaster, as in the case of New Orleans, which lost a lot of its population because people were afraid of the kinds of conditions that might recur over there. And so congestion and pollution are also forces that cause people to stay away from cities. Now, coming back to this question of slums, slums are seen as a blight in cities. They're unattractive, and so there's been a lot of emphasis on trying to remove or eradicate slums in many parts of the developing world. So slum demolition programs have been promoted especially by the wealthier communities in cities, largely to make the cities look more attractive. And so residential welfare associations may want to clean up and reduce crime and so on. The other set of questions has to do with the fact that professional knowledge or planning knowledge deployed to supplant local knowledge, and this results in the erosion of the informal economy. So many slums are actually sites of lots of production, maybe the informal production, but also they contribute to the formal economy in many ways, and this has been proven time and again. Slums are also places which house a bulk of a city's working classes, and this is true particularly in cities like Mumbai, Mexico City, and so on. And and that's usually ignored. So when slum cleanup takes place, people are displaced. They're usually sent to housing that's far away from the cities, and that changes the nature of the labor market in cities. Now, successful cases of rehabilitation are also found, and so successful cases of rehabilitation would mean that people are given better conditions, living conditions, and safer more conditions to live in. That largely improves their lives, but also ensures that the labor forces within the urban settlement are not eroded as a result. But at the same time, you also have to make sure that you overcome other patronage and exploitation conditions that are prevalent in many slums, and providing infrastructure, water, sanitation, and what's known as pakka housing, or well-built housing, and rights to the community-led organizations. These become very important to make these informal economies self-sustaining. In the case of Dharavi in Mumbai, there are over 400 recycling units, 30,000 rag pickers. These individuals, these people, really sustain much of the city of Mumbai. The 6,000 tons of rubbish are sorted every day. In 2007, The Economist magazine reported that in Vietnam and Mozambique, waves of gleaners sift through the sweepings of Hanoi's streets, just as Mozambican children pick over the rubbish of Maputo's main tip. So this is something is very, very common. People living in slums end up being essential to the city's services. There's a book on the subject called The World's Scavengers by Martin Medina, and in Lagos in Nigeria, which is widely considered the world's most chaotic city, there's an environment day on the last Saturday of every month, and from 7 to 10 a.m. nobody drives and the city tries to tidy itself up. So there are multiple ways in which slum dwellers are themselves revitalizing cities in the global south. The question of in-situ rehabilitation is very important because it's a way of revitalizing people living in these slums, and it's also helps ensure that the city's economy doesn't decline as a result of the large part of the labor market disappearing. So in Mumbai's case, they've used an innovative method of using the land on which slums are located to build tenement housing, part of which was provided free to residents and part of which was sold at market rates to finance the construction. So these kinds of innovative methods to actually raise money for in-situ rehabilitation have been tried. And there's of course the scope for some kind of misappropriation in these conditions, these circumstances, but there's also been a lot of success stories. In Ahmedabad, which was another in-situ case where there was in-situ rehabilitation, there was a partnership between government bodies, non-governmental organizations, microfinance bank and slum residents in carrying out slum upgrading. And you've seen this also in the developed world. Philadelphia had a very successful case. In Pakistan, in Karachi, the Orangi case has also been widely cited as a very successful form of in-situ rehabilitation of slum dwellers. Dharavi is really Asia's largest slum, and it contains tens of thousands of small businesses. So vital to the city's economy, as I mentioned earlier, and hundreds of thousands of residents of different religions, castes, languages, provinces and ethnicities. So its enterprises include food, garments, leather products, pottery, printing, jewelry, recycling, and the turnover of the slum alone is about 2,000 crores a year. So a very vibrant economic powerhouse in many ways. So these are some of the, this is a map of Dharavi, and Dharavi residents have themselves organized, organized themselves into groups to adopt a common rehabilitation program, and this is seen as an alternative to the official alternative redevelopment plan. So bringing in the participation of the stakeholders it seems to be very important in these slum rehabilitation experiments. And this is not something that slums are not something that should be wished away. Rather, they need to be rehabilitated. They need better infrastructure, because it turns out that they're usually at the center of the city's people. The Dharavi redevelopment project was initiated through a very large NGO called SPARK, the Society for the Promotion of Area Resource Centers, and they played a significant role with the government for providing housing for 50,000 families. And the policy was confronted by a number of challenges. There was insufficient supply of land. It was Mumbai after all. Insufficient data, lack of coordination among agencies, lack of resources and rigid planning norms. So all of these had to be overcome in order for this redevelopment project to be to have the sort of success it has had. There was a focused attempt at improving land supply, infrastructure, information systems, management and repair of existing house stock, and public awareness was a big part of this. And participation, of course. The policy has been useful, has been proven useful in cases where rehabilitation is necessitated by vital infrastructure projects. Under the current policy, around 100,000 houses have been constructed and an equal number are under construction. So the Dharavi case is something that it was a very difficult environment in Asia's largest slum, and the fact that attempts even in a place like that have been successful suggests that hope is not lost in terms of how to deal with slums in developing countries.